And we're back for the second lecture of part 5. And in this lecture, we're going to be talking about data ownership and privacy. Just a quick review that in the last lecture, we talked about ethics and fairness. And now we're going to move on to data ownership. So in the world of data science, whenever you start a new project, you always ask yourself, well, do I have the data needed to complete this project? And if you do, the next question is always, well, do I have access to the data? Because you always think, oh, I have the data. Yeah. It's it's all to do with this disease, and I know we have enough here at this institution. But then you seldomly think of the detail of, do I actually have access to that data? And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And the first question, whenever you are wondering if you have access to the data, should be who owns the data. Now, interestingly, under U.S. law, there is no property in mere facts. So that means that anything that are like facts are not considered intellectual property. So for instance, here's a good example, your DNA sequence. So everyone would think, oh, well, because it's my DNA and it's unique to me, well, that actual DNA sequence is not considered intellectual property. So you don't own it. However, what you do have is the ability to restrict the access to that DNA sequence. And the ability for you to restrict access is all to do with your rights to privacy. And that is the piece that that's the obstacle really for you to gain access to data. And it makes sense because medical data is personal and therefore should be utilized only with the consent of the individual. So whenever dealing with privacy, we always need to consider the jurisdiction. And in this case, I've given some examples. Of course, I'm situated here at University of Toronto in Ontario, Canada, and therefore in Canada, we have the Privacy Act, which is a federal legislation. There's also the PIPEDA legislation, which is the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, and this applies to all provinces. However, within each province and territory, they will have their own laws that will apply to handling, personal information as well as health information, so personal health information. And for example, here in Ontario, we have the HIPAA legislation, which oversees how health information is managed within the province. If you look to other jurisdictions, I've put, of course, at the bottom here, United States, which is probably the other biggest jurisdiction that you may deal with when trying to gain access to data. And in this case, what you've probably heard of most commonly is HIPAA, which is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, and that is the federal act that governs access to health information, private health information. Just out of interest, I've put a couple more. So the European Union, it will come under GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation, and that applies to all member states. But once again, each member state will also have or could also have legislation specific for the handling of private information or, once again, health information. And I just threw in Costa Rica because when I put this slide together, I was traveling to Costa Rica to talk about this. And in Costa Rica, you have the Personal Data Protection Act, and that's the act that they follow in Costa Rica. So in 2022, the government tabled a bill called Bill C-27 in Parliament. It is still currently in the process of going through Parliament to be approved. And it is also known as the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act. And this new act is the first legislation in Canada that is going to, I guess, slowly bring us to regulating AI. And essentially how that works is just like in the pharmaceutical industry for drugs. Anybody who uses cells, artificial intelligence that's going to impact society, so basically regulated under Health Canada, will be required to do certain things. And these include establish measures to manage anonymized data, conduct impact assessments of their product, maintain general records, which is also called documentation, and that is to meet compliance requirements. If you are working with an artificial intelligent product that is considered high impact, then you're going to have to develop a mitigation plan. You're going to have to monitor those risk mitigation measures. You're also going to have to, once again, do a lot of documentation in order to maintain your status. This act will also update the privacy laws that currently exist. So PIPEDA, and for instance in Ontario it would be PHIPAA, but PIPEDA is the federal legislation. And lastly, if you have AI in medicine, it's going to require that you disclose that in your medical practice you are using an AI solution or product. You're also going to have to give patients the opportunity for a second opinion. If they, once they're told that an AI product was used in their diagnosis, let's say, they can request a second opinion. And finally, you're going to have to provide them with documentation explaining essentially how the AI product works. So essentially that would be the same as interpretability, that you need to be able to explain that to your patients. So all of that is in the works. It's not currently in place yet, but that's where we're headed. I'm going to talk a little bit about PIPEDA because that's the legislation we follow here in Canada. And it is based on fair information principles. We've seen many of these already. I'll just go through these quickly. The first one, of course, accountability. Identifying purpose is part of disclosure. Having to gain consent for people to share their information before you have access to it is very important. The limitation of collection, use, disclosure, and retention, it just means that if you do gain access to data, that you are limited to how long you have access to that data and for what purpose you can use that for. So you can't, after 6 months decide, oh, wow, cool, look at all this fantastic data I have, I'm going to use it for something else. You can't do that. Accuracy, safeguards, openness, I think that's all pretty standard. Individual access and challenging compliance. A lot of that is to do with, safeguarding the data once again, but also for oversight, right? Meaning that challenging compliance means that you need to check, right? You need to make sure that whoever has gained access to the data is compliant in following the PIPEDA legislation. And of course, individual access just means that you need to make sure you identify who will have access to this information at any time, and you need to check on that regularly. So that's something that's a responsibility for, let's say, internal audit for a company or for a group. That let's say every 6 months or at least every year, that you say, okay, well, hey, who has access to all of this sensitive information? Is it still Janet and Bob? And then, oh, look at that. They're not even part of the company anymore. So why are they listed, right? So those are the things that need to be updated on a regular basis. So when you're looking into privacy legislation, you'll find that privacy regulations currently permit database research, so pretty much what we do, to be conducted without the need for individual informed consent. And this is inevitably because what is thought is that this research or the work that you're doing is going to be beneficial for the society at large. And therefore, because there's not going to be a breach of privacy in the sense that no one's going to be identified, it's not going to be shared on an individual level with anybody, they do the regulations that are under the legislation does permit for this type of research without informed consent. However, be careful, these regulations have little impact on common law rights and the duties of researchers or research participants. So meaning that even though the privacy legislation will permit it, if you do abuse it, or if there's a breach, or it's not done in according to policy, or of your institution specifically, then you can be held responsible for it, and then there is recourse, but it would be under common law, civil in a civil court. Now, on the previous slide, we touched on the concept that data could maybe be made available without informed consent, as long as there's no identifiable information, and as long as the information is used for a good cause, like the purpose is important, and that would mean that it's going to benefit the society at large. So the reverse to this is what would happen if there's too much individual control over personal health information. It is possible that it could actually hinder what's called socially valuable biomedical research. And this makes sense that if you had to consent everybody for every time you use their data for all research, it would literally put research on hold, because the time it would take to inform everybody, and then the biggest, actually a bigger problem, is who's going to say yes. There's inevitably going to be bias in that. You as an individual in society will say, you know what, I'm not really interested in participating in that research because I don't believe in that. And what happens then is you have a bias. And that's a problem for us researchers. So it is possible that, too much individual control is actually a bad thing. And that's just something to think about when, dealing with this data ownership and accessing data and all that fun stuff when it comes down to your research. So how do we deal with this whole idea of pretty much borrowing data to do research? So we've already covered that in terms of regulations that come under your legislation, it is possible. You are allowed, in terms of the privacy legislation, you are allowed to use this data in order to perform research. We've also seen as well that there's no intellectual property to facts, so this data. And so you must be thinking, well, that's crazy, because I've always heard that, it's cost you money to get access to this data. And there's the key wording, get access to the data. So it is the gatekeepers. What they're doing is they're not saying we own the data. They don't. But what they do is they control access to the data. And so what they will say is, we don't own the data. It belongs to the patients, and there's no IP in this. However, it's going to cost you for us to retrieve the data and put it into a little sweet package with a bow on it and give it to you to do research. And that is what is the first barrier when you're trying to gain access to data, is dealing with the quote unquote custodian of the data, the institution that is responsible for safeguarding this health information. So one way of dealing with that is implementing what's called a data use agreement. And it basically includes provisions addressing the quality of the data, the integrity, the privacy, the security, the patient control, everything that, pertains to you acquiring the data and how you're going to work with it, safeguard it, everything that we discussed under the PIPEDA principles. This brings us to the user data rights. So you can imagine we've just talked about the user or the patient being in control over whether or not they wish to share data. If there isn't a requirement for informed consent due to the Privacy Acts, then they don't know about it. But it's not identifiable, so it's not a concern for them. There's no risk for them, and their data is just serving a higher purpose. Great. But if you do get consent from the patient, then you must give them the ability to control their data. So what it means is that they can withdraw the consent at any time. So meaning they say, yeah, sure, use my data for research. That's fantastic. But if they change their mind, a couple of years later, then they need to be able to withdraw their consent. So meaning that either the data will be deleted from your database, or if in your consent you clearly stated that it wouldn't be possible for you to do that, in the sense that it's already going to be anonymized and used, or de-identified or whatever, used in research, and you're not going to actually be able to extract it a couple of years later, then it will be clearly said, stated in the consent that that's not going to be possible. However, any further use of any of the data will cease, right? And that's fine. Now, how about afterwards? Once you've developed your wonderful AI solution and you've put it out in the world and everything's great, the question then is your solution should provide the user control over how they interact with your solution, and what data is collected and used and move forward. So that's very important to keep in mind as well. It doesn't just stop after they've given you data to do the training of your algorithm. It carries on and through once you have your solution. And once again, you may be collecting data during the use of your solution, and therefore that needs to be clearly baked into the solution in terms of providing, in a sense, consent. So it may not be explicit, but you're definitely going to state in let's say the user manual or some kind of disclaimer when they agree to use the software, that this is how their data is going to be safeguarded or used or not collected or etc. Now, following through on that, just some interesting facts. The European Commission found that 71% of its citizens find it unacceptable for companies to share information about them without their permission. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. That is a very strong majority. Now, these percentages will inevitably rise as artificial intelligence is further used to either amplify our privacy or undermine it. And this is something that has come up from IBM Watson, what they consider their everyday ethics. So everything we've been talking about, IBM Watson has thought about and has published on their website, for full disclosure, for transparency on how the IBM Watson product is being used and in what capacity and all that kind of stuff. So they're actually ahead of the curve in that sense, that they've taken that big step forward to say, hey, this is how we operate. This is what's going on. This is, and essentially they're inviting people to I guess assess how they're dealing with it, and inevitably they're going to change with the requests and demands from the population at large. So ownership of patient data has always been tricky. Bottom line, though, is, of course, the patient themselves or their power of attorney own that data. But when you say own, what do you mean by ownership? So that's just an interesting question, because really what it is it's control. So who has control of that data? Who has the right to share it? Who has the right to view it? Or delete it for that matter. The reason being is that facts, so like, your body weight, your, diagnostic testing, those, your genome, for instance, your genotype, what makes up your genotype, these facts or data is not considered by law as intellectual property. Okay, so when you say ownership, then inevitably you're going to say, well, how do I defend that in terms of a legal way? How do I defend the ownership of that if there's no intellectual property to it? And so really what you're doing is you're saying what I own is the rights to it and access to it. Now, in the case in Canada, the provincial government also has the right to access that information, inevitably because the provincial government actually paid for that data, because you're living in Canada, which has a single payer healthcare system, and the provincial governments of Canada are those single payers. So because of that, they actually own the rights to your data as well, which makes it fair because inevitably they're providing you a service and they need that data in order to provide you that service. So that's the way I would see it as fair. Now, in terms of moving forward and who you can share with and all that stuff, all of that is going to be set in what's called terms and agreements for any relationship that you may enter in, which would involve your data. But just remember, that's essentially what is the most important is who is able to access your data, use your data, delete your data, whatever. It's you first, of course, as the patient. That provincial government shares with you that privilege, and then you can extend it to any party you wish to enter into an agreement with. But finally, what's important is that your physician or anybody in the healthcare team become what's called custodians, so data custodians. So they're the ones who collect it, they're the ones that read it, interpret it, and so they are custodians of your data. Okay, so let's spend a little time just going over what users should be able to expect in this new world of artificial intelligence solutions. So, of course, obviously, users should maintain control over what data is being used and in what context. They should have the ability to deny access to personal data that they may find inappropriate for artificial intelligence. The data from users must be protected, of course, from theft, from misuse, corruption. That is data security. And one should always provide full disclosure on how the personal information is being used and shared. So when we operationalize these restrictions, I guess, we need to allow users to deny service or data by having the AI solution ask for permission before an interaction, or by providing the option during an interaction. And this will all come out under the privacy settings and permissions that are made clear when users interact with your software. Now, other companies should not be using data without permission when creating a new AI service. Of course, we've talked about that. That's a no-brainer. And we need to recognize and follow national and international laws and rights when using AI. And, I'm just saying this and people are like, oh, your eyes are glazing over. But I can tell you that this is probably one of the most important, steps to being successful because we meaning everyone, society is paying attention to how artificial intelligence driven software is being deployed and used in society. And the FDA is spending a lot of time right now dealing with what's called software as a medical device in terms of how are they adapting the current regulations that come under the regulatory compliance of devices. And they're adding a lot to it in terms of oversight and how it's supposed to operate in society. And of course, all of this is for safety, right? Or most of it. Most of it is for safety, and then you have the privacy, of course. So there's the both of them. So safety, compliance. I guess the first focus in regulatory compliance is safety, and then after that will come privacy, your rights, to privacy. So now that I brought up the regulatory compliance aspect, let's just kind of talk about that a little bit. So currently, it is actually difficult to regulate this space because there are no universal approaches or guidelines. And that is something that is, as I just mentioned in the previous slide, that is currently being put together, and it's by jurisdiction. So every jurisdiction is currently looking at how are they going to regulate this tsunami of AI software. Now, developers like us do not all study medicine, and they need to learn how software should operate in a clinical setting in order to create their algorithms. And finally, the lack of exposure in the clinical setting will inevitably result in a degree of mistrust. And so there has to be involvement of all stakeholders when you develop your AI solutions. So what is currently being done? As I said, lots, and this is just a tiny little taste of what's going on, but you have IEEE global initiatives on ethics of autonomous and intelligent systems, and this is led by the IBM group, and they focus on autonomous intelligent systems ethics. There is criteria and metrics for ethical AI systems that need to be developed and will depend on the industry that they are based in. And of course, this will be, also will be included use cases for where they operate. And finally, as I mentioned, the FDA has a strict acceptance criteria for what's called software as a medical device. And they also, but they have currently already approved some assistive algorithms, and they are working towards, allowing AI software to be diagnostic and to have that medical device classification where the software itself will be permitted to make a diagnostic decision, which is a big deal when you think of it. So what's SAMD? Software as a medical device. Well, in the delivery of healthcare, you have medical devices which are regulated under the Health Canada and the FDA, and they are essentially tools which enable healthcare providers to deliver their services, right? So in healthcare. Now, of course, they're regulated because these devices are responsible for, or can be responsible for, diagnosis. They can be responsible for treatment. They can actually go anywhere from being, pressed up on your skin like a Band-Aid into or something which is invasive like laparoscopy. So these devices need to be inevitably regulated to make sure that they're safe. Now, software as a medical device is software that behaves like a medical device and therefore is regulated like a medical device. And that's why it's called software as a medical device. So these software need to be assessed and tested just like medical devices, and then they get assigned a classification. So why is this a big deal? Well, because with artificial intelligence, there is more and more interesting, helpful, impactful software that's going to be used or is being proposed to be used as a means to diagnose. Mostly, that's most of what it does is diagnosis, but also some of it can be involved in treatment. And so for that reason, it needs to be regulated. And so Health Canada and FDA recognize that with the rise of AI, that this is a concern, because for them to be able to regulate all these software that are coming out is tricky and very time consuming and a lot of work for them. And so they recognize that it's a bit of it's not a bit, it's a large challenge that they need to address. And this brings us to the end of lecture 2. I hope you didn't find these 2 lectures too dry. I do realize it's not everybody's cup of tea talking about data ownership and ethics. However, it is important, in my opinion, that we do touch on this subject, because I think as developers, researchers, clinician scientists, that we are all responsible for doing the right thing. I mean, bottom line is it's doing the right thing, right? So safeguarding data, safeguarding privacy, ethics, performing ethical research. Basically, the reason for that is because the people who support our research are members of our society. So that's the reason we do the research, is to benefit society. So we, of course, have to include them at the table as stakeholders in all of our projects. Now, of course, you're going to think, oh my God, that's just, where are you going with this? Well, no, I mean, if you think of it, I mean, it's just, when you set up a project, it's really not that hard to always, include at the table the stakeholders, the end user. So the reason it's so important is because it's part of knowledge translation. As you know, that's a big focus. But it also keeps you grounded, is my opinion. Does it mean that you have to have an actual user on your board, or on your, in your committee or whatever? No, maybe not. But you definitely need to consider those stakeholders, their opinions, their perspectives, just to make sure that you, when you develop your research plan, that you're not biased, essentially. Anyway, in the next part, it's going to be pretty much a wrap up, and we're going to overview some of the interesting concepts we've covered to date in this course. And I look forward to seeing you there.